What if everything you believe about one of history's most influential figures was a lie? For 2,000 years, billions of people have built their lives around a man named Jesus of Nazareth. But did he really exist? Or is he simply the greatest myth ever created by humanity? Today, two brilliant minds clash in an unprecedented intellectual duel. Dr. Marcus Veritatum, a Christian historian and archaeologist, specialist in historical critical methods. For him, denying Jesus is denying historical science itself. Dr. Sophia Skeptikos, a skeptic and comparative mythologist, master at exposing ancient legends. She believes Jesus is just another invented god used to control the masses. Two experts, 20 arguments each. One question that could shake the very foundations of Western civilization. Are you prepared to question everything? Welcome to Clashing Ideas, where humanity's most controversial ideas collide.
Colleagues, applying standard historical criteria like multiple attestation, the criterion of embarrassment and dissimilarity. The existence of Jesus is more solid than many ancient figures we accept without hesitation. We have at least 11 independent sources from the 1st century, the 4 Gospels based on distinct oral traditions: Paul, Hebrews, James, 1 Peter, and external sources like the Testimonium Flavianum of Josephus and Tacitus Annales. Compare that to Alexander the Great. We rely on just 2 major biographies, both written centuries after his death. Yet no one questions his existence.
My esteemed colleague commits the classic fallacy of false equivalence. Alexander left behind coins with his face, cities bearing his name, and contemporary records across Greek, Persian, and Egyptian sources. What about just this? 0 contemporary material evidence. Your 11 sources are all late Christian texts or based on Christian testimony. The Testimonium Flavianum is considered partially or wholly interpolated by over 60% of scholars, even Christian researchers. Like Ken Olson have demonstrated this using computational stylistic analysis and Tacitus? He merely echoed what Christians were saying 85 years later, not events he himself witnessed.
You conveniently ignore the fact that even skeptics like Bart Ehrman, Gerd Ludemann, and Morris Casey emphatically affirm Jesus' historical existence. In 2012, Ehrman wrote that denying Jesus' existence is as plausible as believing the earth. It's flat, the scholarly consensus is overwhelming. 99.7% of historians specializing in the period affirm Jesus' historicity. Furthermore, the criterion of embarrassment devastates mythicist theories. Why invent a crucified Messiah? Crucifixion was considered a divine curse in Judaism. Deuteronomy 21:23, and the ultimate shame in the Greco-Roman world. No group would fabricate such a defect in their hero.
Appeal to authority is not a valid scientific argument. Doctor, remember, 99% of astronomers once knew the Earth was the center of the universe. Consensus can stem from academic tradition, not rigorous evidence, and your view of the embarrassment of crucifixion overlooks ancient myth entirely. Dionysus was torn apart, Attis was castrated and killed, Adonis was gored to death by a boar. Suffering gods were common. Crucifixion, specifically, appears in Pindar's Anaphe as a divine regenerative sacrifice. Christianity didn't invent the dying god, it merely Judaism's a pre-existing archetype.
Your mythological comparison fails on a crucial point: historical specificity. Jesus didn't die in mythic time. He died under Pontius Pilate, a historically attested figure known from coins and inscriptions like the famous Pilate stone. Discovered in 1961 at multiple independent sources. We even have embarrassing details like Simon of Cyrene carrying the cross, Mark 15:21. Why invent a random African character? Or the fact that women were the first witnesses of the resurrection, in a culture where female testimony held no legal weight. These are details that only make sense if rooted in real memory, not literary construction.
Specific details don't prove historicity, they prove good storytelling. Homer places the Trojan War in geographically accurate locations, names real kings, and depicts authentic Bronze Age customs. Does that make Achilles historical? Simon F. Serene. Could have been added to connect the narrative to emerging African Christian communities. A missionary strategy, not a memory, and women as witnesses? Precisely because they were unreliable in that culture, they became proof of divine authenticity. God chooses the weak to shame the strong. That's theology, not history.
Let's apply fair historiographical standards. How many first-century Jewish carpenters would you expect to find in surviving Roman records? Pontius Pilate ruled for only 10 years. And the only surviving documents from his administration are a few coins and one inscription. We lack contemporary records for 99.99% of all people who lived back then. But we have something better. Structured oral tradition. Kenneth Bailey, a specialist in Middle Eastern oral cultures, demonstrated that traditional communities preserve core narratives with remarkable accuracy over decades. Paul, writing only 15 to 20 years after the crucifixion, quotes pre-existing creeds, 1 Corinthians 15 to 3 to 7. That scholars date to just 2 to 5 years after the events.
Oral tradition? Seriously? Frederick Bartlett's studies on serial memory show that stories become radically distorted after just a few transmissions. The telephone game isn't a joke, it's cognitive science, and you mention Paul, yet Hanover references Jesus directly, no Nazareth, no Bethlehem, no Mary or Joseph, no specific miracles or parables. Paul's Christ is a cosmic figure, not a Galilean preacher. How do you explain that the supposed greatest Christian missionary entirely ignores Jesus' biography? That strongly suggests that the biographical Jesus was constructed after Paul, not before.
That's blatant cherry-picking. Paul mentions that Jesus was born of a woman. Born under the law, Galatians 4:2-4, had brothers, including James, Galatians 1:19, was betrayed on the night of the Last Supper, 1 Corinthians 11:23, crucified, 1 Corinthians 1:23, buried, and resurrected, 1 Corinthians 15:2-4. He clearly distinguishes between direct revelations, the Lord told me, and received tradition, I passed on what I received from the Lord. He personally knew Peter, James, and other original apostles. His letters weren't biographies. They were occasional letters focused on apostolic authority, not storytelling.
Born of a woman is mythic language. Compare with born of earth for chthonic heroes and James. The brother of the Lord could just mean spiritual brother, as all Christians were called. Richard Carrier has shown that the Greek grammar allows this interpretation. More importantly, why does Paul never quote Jesus' teachings to resolve Christian disputes? When discussing marriage, divorce, taxes, he either makes up arguments or cites the Old Testament. If Jesus really said, "Give to Caesar what is Caesar's," why didn't Paul reference that when talking about obeying government? The silence is deafening.
You're distorting the evidence. Paul does quote Jesus. The marriage should not separate, not I, but the Lord, 1 Corinthians 7:10. And he clearly separates his own opinion from Jesus' commands. As for brother of the Lord, the natural reading of Adelphos is biological brother. It would require specific context to mean otherwise. More devastating, Paul violently persecuted Christians before converting. If Jesus were a made-up myth, why such fierce opposition? People don't persecute harmless fictions, they persecute real disruptive movements.
Paul persecuted a sect that threatened Jewish orthodoxy. That doesn't prove its founder existed. Marxists persecuted Stalinists. Protestants killed Catholics. Rival ideologies create real violence regardless of the historicity of their founders. And you cite one possible reference to Jesus' teaching, one in hundreds of Pauline passages. Compare that with how often Paul quotes the Old Testament. If Jesus really taught for 3 years, where are the dozens of sayings? The imbalance is the opposite of what we'd expect from someone in contact with eyewitnesses.
Archaeology has consistently supported the basic historicity of the Gospels. Excavations in Capernaum revealed exactly the kind of house Peter would have. Lived in a first-century structure with signs of early Christian veneration. The so-called Jesus boat, discovered in the Sea of Galilee, dates precisely to the correct period and perfectly matches Gospel descriptions. Shimon Gibson uncovered the pool of Siloam, mentioned in John 9. Exactly where the text claims the Nazareth synagogue was discovered beneath the Basilica of the Annunciation. James Charlesworth of Princeton cataloged dozens of such archaeological correlations. If the Gospels were pure fiction, how did they get so many verifiable details right?
Correlation is not causation, doctor. Ancient authors often researched geography and customs meticulously to enhance believability. Virgil's Aeneid describes Rome with stunning precision. Does that make Aeneas historical? The existence of a place doesn't prove that the events described there actually occurred. And many of these correlations are retroactive. Later Christians identified sites based on the Gospels, not the other way around. You also ignore the discrepancies. For example, Luke places a census of Quirinius during Herod's reign. Yet it historically occurred 10 years after Herod's death if the Gospels were eyewitness accounts. Basic chronological errors would be unthinkable.
The census issue reflects Roman administrative complexity, not gospel error. Colin Hemmer showed that Luke had extraordinarily accurate knowledge of official titles, maritime routes, local customs, and political timelines. 84 verifiable details in Acts alone. Such precision would be impossible for a late forger. Even more compelling, the 1990 discovery of the ossuary of Yehoseph bar Caiapha, Joseph Caiaphas, the high priest mentioned in the Gospels, and in 1968, archaeologists uncovered the remains of Yohanan ben Haggall, a first-century man crucified with a nail still lodged through his heel. Physical evidence that crucifixion occurred just as described in the Gospels.
You're confusing geographic precision with historical reliability. Arthur Conan Doyle described Victorian London in perfect detail. Does that make Sherlock Holmes real? Luke may have been a competent researcher without being an eyewitness. Crucifixion was a common Roman execution method. Finding one crucified skeleton doesn't prove that Jesus himself was crucified. That's like saying finding a crashed car proves a specific person died in a car accident. As for Caiaphas, yes, he existed. But that doesn't validate the dialogues attributed to him in the Gospels. That would be like saying knowing that Abraham Lincoln exited Provs. He said everything in Hollywood films.
But there's an unmistakable pattern. Every new archaeological discovery affirms, never contradicts, the basic gospel context. The so-called House of Peter in Capernaum shows signs of Christian veneration dating back to the 1st century. Walls covered with early Christian graffiti in Greek Syriac and Latin. Why would Christians venerate a random house unless it held real historical significance? Likewise, the James ossuary inscribed James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus, though controversial, reflects a family configuration consistent with the New Testament. André Lemaire, epigrapher at the Sorbonne, confirms the inscription is authentic and dates to the 1st century.
The James ossuary is a perfect case study in how faith-driven forgery contaminates evidence. Oda Galan was formally indicted for forgery by the Israel Antiquities Authority. The second half of the inscription, brother of Jesus, shows chemical differences in patina, strongly suggesting a later addition. And post-event veneration does not validate original events. Catholics venerate thousands of relics later proven to be fake. The House of Peter was not identified as such until the 4th century, when Helena, Constantine's mother, conveniently discovered all major Christian holy sites. That's not archaeology, that's religious tourism.
Mythological parallels collapse under rigorous scrutiny. Jonathan Z. Smith, from the University of Chicago, demonstrated that the alleged similarities between Mythos and pagan deities are superficial or anachronistic. Mithras was not born on December 25th. That date was assigned to Jesus only in the 4th century. Dionysus did not resurrect. In the Christian sense, he was reassembled after dismemberment. A completely different concept. More importantly, 1st century. Judaism was fiercely monotheistic and anti-syncretistic. The Maccabees died resisting to Hellenism. How would Orthodox Jews suddenly start copying pagan myths they viewed as abominations? Cultural resistance makes mythic borrowing virtually impossible.
That's a naive view of ancient Judaism. The Hellenistic period 33 to 63 BCE deeply permeated Jewish culture. Why do you think the New Testament was written in Greek, not Hebrew? David Flusser showed extensive parallels between late Jewish literature and Greek philosophy. The very concept of logos in the Gospel of John comes directly from Stoic Hellenism. Filter through Philo of Alexandria and consider the suffering servant in Isaiah 53, a deliberately vague prophecy that could be retroactively applied to any martyr. Jesus fulfilled prophecies because he was literally constructed to fulfill them, not because he did so historically.
You've reversed historical logic. The use of Greek was pragmatic. It was the lingua franca of the Eastern Mediterranean. It's not proof of religious syncretism. Jews translated the Torah into Greek, the Septuagint, 2 centuries before Jesus. While maintaining strict monotheism, Philo of Alexandria used Greek philosophical language. Yet he categorically rejected pagan mythology. As for Isaiah 53, N.T. Wright showed that the prophecy was so specific that pre-Christian Jews avoided applying it to the Messiah. They expected a military conqueror, not a suffering servant. Jesus inverted traditional messianic expectations. If he were invented, he would have aligned with popular hopes, not contradicted them.
Wright overlooks key evidence. The Dead Sea Scrolls show far more diverse messianic expectations than the simplistic military conqueror model. For Q5-1 describes a Messiah who raises the dead and brings good news to the poor, identical language to the Gospels, and the suffering servant is a peering Qumran text applied to eschatological figures. Second Temple Judaism was far more apocalyptic and magical than mainstream scholarship admits. Texts like 1 Enoch show a complex angelology that directly influenced early Christian Christology. Jesus is a product of that apocalyptic ferment, not a rupture from it.
Excellent point about Qumran, but that actually strengthens my position. If diverse messianic expectations existed in pre-Christian Judaism, then Jesus fits perfectly within a real historical context, not as a borrowed pagan myth, the fact. That similar concepts appear in 4Q5-1 suggests Jesus was operating within authentic Jewish categories. Moreover, the differences are crucial. The Qumran Messiah remains earthly. Jesus transcends to a cosmic dimension that conceptual evolution points to real historical development, not mere literary construction.
Or it points to clever amplification of existing Jewish traditions. That's exactly what we would expect from sophisticated literary construction. And you're ignoring the most important factor, time. Paul writes just 15 to 20 years after Jesus' alleged death, yet presents a fully developed Christology, divine pre-existence, incarnation, cosmic atonement. Such theological leaps take generations, not decades. Compare that to Buddhism. It took centuries for the historical Buddha to become deified. The speed of Christian theological development suggests myth-making from the start, not gradual elaboration of a real person.
The argument from silence is both logically fallacious and historically naive. How many first-century texts have actually survived? A microscopic fraction. We don't have a single complete work of secular Jewish literature from the period. Not from Philo only fragments, nor from anyone else. The Library of Alexandria was destroyed. The temple archives burned in 70 CE. Historian Michael Grant estimates that less than 0.01% of ancient literature has survived. Add to that, Jesus operated for only 1 to 3 years, in a remote province among illiterate peasants. Why would Seneca or Pliny the Elder mention a Galilean itinerant preacher? That would be like expecting 1950s newspapers to cover every rural pastor in the American Midwest.
But Jesus was supposedly not just a rural preacher. The Gospels describe crowds of thousands, public resurrections, a triumphal entry into Jerusalem, temple disruption, and supernatural darkness during the crucifixion. If events of that magnitude occurred, the total silence is baffling. Philo of Alexandria wrote extensively about contemporary Jewish politics. He mentions Pilate, minor revolts, even sectarian leaders. Why does he completely ignore someone said to have shaken all of Palestine? And Josephus, famously obsessed with cataloging Jewish messiahs and prophets, originally did not mention Jesus. The Testimonium Flavianum appears only in later Christian manuscripts.
You dramatically overstate the silence. First, not all gospel events were necessarily spectacular to contemporaries. Crowds could mean hundreds, not thousands. Second, we do have mentions. Josephus, even if interpolated, most. Scholars accept a core authenticity: Tacitus, possibly Suetonius, and Pliny the Younger. Third, Christianity exploded after 70 CE. That's when we start seeing more references. The timeline makes perfect sense. Most importantly, we have massive indirect evidence. The very existence of the early Christian movement demands explanation. Real movements require real founders.
Movements based on mythical figures are historically common. Hinduism has millions of devotees who worship Krishna. Does that prove he was historical? The Mithraic cult dominated the Roman army for centuries, based on a completely mythical figure. Mystery religions flourished without identifiable historical founders. Early Christianity may have begun as a mystical movement based on visionary revelations, as Paul himself describes his conversion. Only later did it develop biographical narratives to give historical flesh to spiritual experiences.
But there are crucial qualitative differences. Krishna exists in mythical time, performing fantastical feats. Jesus is placed in a precise historical setting, surrounded by known figures and verifiable locations. Mithras was never presented as a recent historical person, always as a timeless cosmic deity. Christianity, by contrast, grounds itself in recent eyewitness claims. We saw, we touched, many witnesses are still alive. 1 John 1:1. 1 Corinthians 15:6. This temporal specificity makes mythic theories deeply problematic. False claims about recent events would be too easy to debunk.
But such eyewitness claims are exactly what we expect from persuasive literary construction. Ancient authors routinely invoked eyewitness authority to build credibility. It was a rhetorical convention, not historical proof. Lucian of Samosata satirized this in True History, mocking how anyone could claim to have seen the impossible. And let's be clear, none of these alleged eyewitnesses left writings of their own. Everything is filtered through later authors with clear theological agendas. Where are Peter's diaries, John's memoirs? The total absence of first-hand testimony is highly suspicious.
When applying standard historiographical criteria rigorously, Jesus passes all the tests: multiple attestation, independent sources. Mark, Q, John, Paul, Hebrews. Criterion of embarrassment: elements that harm the Christian cause, humble. Origins: crucifixion, Peter's denial. Disciples: abandonment. Criterion of dissimilarity: teachings that don't fit neatly into Judaism or later Christianity. Unconditional forgiveness. Open table fellowship. Radical social ethics. Criterion of coherence: a consistent pattern of behavior and teaching. John Mayer, in A Marginal Jew, shows that the historical Jesus emerges clearly when these filters are systematically applied.
These criteria are circular and problematic. Multiple attestation assumes independence, yet Mark likely influenced all other Gospels. The so-called Q source is hypothetical. It may have never existed as a standalone document. Embarrassment assumes authors wouldn't invent negative traits, but sophisticated narratives always include human flaws for credibility. Shakespeare made Hamlet indecisive and melancholic. Does that make Hamlet historical? And dissimilarity is logically flawed. If Jesus were totally dissimilar from Judaism, he wouldn't be Jewish. If totally dissimilar from later Christianity, he couldn't be its founder.
You're misrepresenting the criteria to dismiss them. Multiple attestation doesn't demand full independence, only distinct traditions, and we clearly have that. The two-source hypothesis, Mark plus Q, is accepted by 95% of scholars precisely because it explains observable literary patterns. As for embarrassment, it's not about humanizing flaws, it's about theologically inconvenient content. Why invent that Jesus was baptized by John the Baptist, implying inferiority? Why fabricate the theologically awkward claim that Jesus didn't know the date of the final judgment? These only make sense as historical memories too uncomfortable to suppress.
The baptism by John serves obvious narrative functions. It establishes continuity with a more historically probable figure, and theologically justifies Christian baptism. The not knowing motif resolves failed apocalyptic expectations. Even Jesus didn't know when the end would come. Be patient. These are literary strategies, not historical admissions. And the two-source theory is increasingly challenged by scholars like Mark Goodacre and Michael Goulder, who argue that Luke could have used just Mark and Matthew, eliminating the need for Q entirely.
Even if Q were eliminated, we still have multiple independent traditions. Mark, John, clearly independent, Paul, and pre-literary oral traditions detectable through form criticism. Even Rudolf Bultmann, despite his extreme skepticism, admitted that some traditions trace back to Jesus himself. More decisive still is the criterion of historical causality, pre-Christian Judaism plus post-70 CE. Christianity equals a historical gap demanding a cause. Something must have occurred between 32-33 CE to explain the radical transformation we see. Mythic theories fail to provide a plausible cause for the observable effects.
But that historical gap can easily be filled by normal sociological processes. Visionary apocalyptic movements arise spontaneously in times of social crisis. And first-century Palestine was exactly that. The destruction of the temple in 70 CE created a spiritual vacuum that Christianity filled. Look at Melanesian cargo cults, or the ghost dance movement among Native Americans. They developed elaborate mythologies without any historical founder. Sociology of religion shows that stressed communities generate imagined salvific figures. Jesus could be the product of collected trauma and mythopedic hope, not a historical man.
One of the most compelling aspects is the hostile testimony sources that mention Jesus without any interest in promoting Christianity. The Babylonian Talmud Sanhedrin 43a refers to a Yeshu executed on the eve of Passover for sorcery and leading Israel astray, exactly what we'd expect from a Jewish source hostile to a historical Jesus. Celsus Skla, a second-century pagan philosopher hostile to Christianity, never questions Jesus' existence. He only mocks his humble origins and disgraceful death. If Jesus were a myth, why didn't these opponents seize that obvious line of attack? Their silence about myth-making suggests that even critics accepted Jesus' basic historicity.
But the Talmud was compiled centuries later and may reflect later anti-Christian polemic, not independent historical memory. Yeshu was a common name Joshua, Jesus, and could refer to any number of sectarian leaders. As for Celsus, he wrote 150 years after the alleged events. Plenty of time for myths to solidify into accepted facts. Moreover, attacking someone's existence is a weaker rhetorical strategy than mocking their biography. It's more effective to say, your hero was a criminal, than, your hero never existed, especially if your audience already believes he did. Mockery, not denial, was the path of least resistance.
Let's consider the cumulative and convergent evidence. 1. Multiple independent Christian sources. 2. Possible Jewish references. 3. Mentions in Greco-Roman authors for consistent archaeological context. 5. Plausible sociological development of the movement. 6. Total absence of ancient counter-theories denying Jesus' existence. Philosopher William Lane Craig argues that the Bayesian probability of Jesus' historicity, considering all the evidence, approaches 95%. At this point, the burden of proof rests on those who reject the overwhelming consensus of the specialist academic community.
And I accept that challenge. This so-called cumulative evidence is illusory. When all the sources stem from the same early Christian tradition, it's like claiming that multiple versions of Cinderella prove her historicity. Academic consensus can be shaped by cultural tradition, not by scientific rigor. Let's not forget that Western academia was dominated by Christians for centuries. Institutional bias is inevitable. More importantly, even if Jesus existed, that doesn't validate any supernatural claims about him. The historical question is distinct from the theological one. We can accept a Jewish apocalyptic preacher without affirming divinity, miracles, or resurrection. The historical Jesus, if he lived, was likely very different from the Christ of faith.
Colleagues, after examining all available evidence through rigorous historiographical lenses, the conclusion is inescapable. Jesus of Nazareth was a real historical figure who lived in first-century Palestine, taught publicly, gathered followers, clashed with religious and political authorities, and was executed by crucifixion under Pontius Pilate. This basic conclusion is supported by converging lines of evidence. an overwhelming academic consensus, and a lack of plausible alternative theories. This, of course, does not resolve theological questions about his divinity. That is a matter of faith, not history, but it does establish the necessary foundation for all future theological or philosophical debate. The historical Jesus may have been just a charismatic, apocalyptic preacher, but he was a real preacher, not a mythical invention. And the magnitude of his legacy, from art and ethics to empire and ideology, suggests an extraordinary human presence. Even on secular terms, intellectual integrity demands that we follow the evidence where it leads, not where we wish it to lead, and the evidence leads us to a historical Jesus.
My colleague speaks of following the evidence, but I would argue we are following traditions masquerading as evidence. What we have are not brute facts, but interpretations of texts written decades after the alleged events, by communities with strong theological agendas. Yes, it's possible that a Jewish apocalyptic preacher once lived and inspired the movement we now call Christianity, but the evidence isn't sufficient to establish this as historical certainty. What is more probable is a complex process of literary, mythical, and sociological development, crystallizing around a figure who may have been historical, legendary, or entirely symbolic. What we can say with certainty is that the Jesus we know, the Jesus of the Gospels, is a literary and theological construction, not a historical biography. Even if a historical Jesus existed, he is now lost to us, buried beneath layers of interpretation, apologetics, and myth-making. Intellectual honesty requires that we acknowledge the limits of our knowledge sometimes. The wisest answer is we don't know, and perhaps we never will.
Ladies and gentlemen, what we have just witnessed is a debate that perfectly captures the intricate nature of historical investigation. Both speakers applied rigorous methods, cited relevant evidence, and upheld high academic standards. Dr. Varatatam showed that the basic historical existence of Jesus enjoys substantial support when we apply standard historiographical criteria. Dr. Skepticos demonstrated that even those same criteria can be challenged, and that alternative theories deserve serious consideration. What emerges here is a deeper lesson about the very nature of historical inquiry. We almost never deal in absolute certainties when it comes to the distant past. We deal in probabilities, not mathematical proofs. This debate illustrates that intelligent, well-informed minds can look at the same evidence and reach different conclusions, and that's not a weakness of historical methodology. It's one of its greatest strengths: continuous debate, constant re-evaluation of the sources, and the willingness to challenge established consensus. These are exactly what keep historical scholarship alive, honest, and dynamic. Thank you both for this stimulating intellectual exercise. May it continue to inspire rigorous investigation and respectful dialogue about one of the most fascinating questions in all of human history. And now you, in the audience of 4 Channel, what do you believe? What's your take on all this? We truly want to hear your voice. Join the conversation in the comments below. Until next time, stay curious, stay critical, and may your day be filled with knowledge.